Maybe you blocked them. Maybe you stopped replying, deleted the conversation, and chose complete silence. Part of you probably believed that once you disappeared, they would immediately realize what they had lost and come looking for you. But that never happened. At least, not as quickly as you expected. Now you're left questioning everything. Did you make the wrong decision? Did they ever care in the first place? Was the relationship only meaningful to you? Before you convince yourself of those conclusions, hear me out. The way an avoidant responds to your absence is rarely as straightforward as it appears. In fact, what happens beneath the surface is far more complicated than most people ever realize, and it reveals much more about their internal world than their outward behavior ever could. One of the biggest misunderstandings about no contact is believing you're dealing with someone who simply doesn't feel anything. That's usually not what's happening. Instead, your silence activates a complicated chain of psychological reactions that unfolds over time. Most people never witness the entire process because they interrupt it themselves. They send another message, make another phone call, apologize, or try one last time to reconnect. By doing that, they stop the emotional process before it has the opportunity to fully develop. So whether you're currently in no contact, thinking about starting it, or wondering what happened after breaking it, stay with me. In this video from Avoidant Mastery, we're going to walk through each stage of what often takes place inside an avoidant's mind after communication completely stops. By the end, you'll have a much deeper understanding of these patterns and why they unfold the way they do. If you've ever gone completely silent with an avoidant, leave the word silent in the comments. I'd love to see how many people have experienced this journey. Now, let's begin with the first stage, because this is where so many people completely misunderstand what's happening. When contact first ends, the avoidant's immediate emotional response usually isn't grief, panic, or longing. It's relief. I know that can be painful to hear. It can feel deeply personal, but it's important to understand what that relief actually represents. It isn't proof that you meant nothing to them. It's their attachment system responding exactly as it has been conditioned to for years. Many avoidants develop nervous systems that learn to associate emotional closeness with stress rather than safety. For them, intimacy can unconsciously trigger the same internal alarm system that activates during danger. Their body reacts before their conscious mind even understands what's happening. While you were actively present in their life, sharing emotions, building closeness, and creating connection, their nervous system was often working overtime beneath the surface. Even if they genuinely cared for you, even if they wanted the relationship, there was often an underlying tension quietly running in the background. Once communication stops, that internal pressure temporarily fades. That's the relief they're experiencing. But here's what makes this stage so deceptive. That relief doesn't last forever. In many cases, it becomes the very thing that sets the next phase in motion. During the first several days, they may genuinely appear perfectly fine. They stay busy, spend time with friends, focus on work, and continue posting on social media as though nothing has changed. If you've ever checked their profile during this period, you've probably wondered how they could seem so unaffected. This is often the point where people convince themselves the avoidant never cared. But appearances rarely tell the full story. Underneath that calm exterior, something subtle begins changing. Usually, somewhere between the third and seventh day, although timing varies depending on the individual and the relationship, they begin noticing something different. Not your presence, your absence. There's an important distinction between the two. When you were still part of their daily life, much of their mental energy went into managing closeness, regulating uncomfortable emotions, and keeping themselves from feeling overwhelmed. Once you're gone, there's nothing left to manage. That empty space creates room for memories to quietly return. They remember the little routines, the familiar conversations, the good morning messages, the jokes that only the two of you shared, and the moments when they felt understood despite their tendency to pull away. At this stage, however, don't expect them to immediately reach out. Their old programming is still in control. If closeness has always felt emotionally risky, contacting you means moving back toward that discomfort. Instead of acting on what they're beginning to feel, they'll often explain it away. They'll tell themselves they're only missing the routine, that it's simply habit, that it isn't really about you. They minimize those emotions so consistently that they almost convince themselves they're true. Almost. The problem is that ignored emotions don't disappear. They simply sink beneath the surface, where they continue building pressure. By the second week of consistent silence, another shift often begins. The mental story they relied on to justify emotional distance starts becoming harder to maintain. Avoidants frequently cope by focusing on reasons the relationship felt overwhelming. They remind themselves there was too much pressure, too many expectations, or too little personal space. At first, your absence seems to validate that belief. They think, maybe this freedom is exactly what I needed. But as more time passes, that initial sense of freedom stops growing. It levels off. And that's when the cracks begin to appear. The narrative they created to protect themselves slowly loses its strength. Instead of remembering only the difficult moments, positive memories begin finding their way back into awareness. For someone who naturally suppresses emotional vulnerability, those memories can feel surprisingly powerful. They're unfamiliar, confusing, sometimes even unsettling. At this stage, some avoidants begin what psychologists often describe as a proximity test. This stage is usually very subtle. It might show up as them quietly watching every one of your Instagram stories. Maybe they randomly like a photo you posted months ago in the middle of the night. Perhaps they send a message that seems completely ordinary, asking about something insignificant or mentioning a random topic that doesn't really matter. None of these actions are accidental. They're designed to feel low risk. If you respond in a way that feels uncomfortable for them, they can easily pretend the interaction meant nothing at all. This isn't a genuine attempt to reconnect. It's more like someone carefully dipping a single toe into the water before deciding whether it's safe to step any closer. And this is where many people unknowingly push the avoidant right back into withdrawal. If your response is overly excited, emotionally intense, or feels like you're instantly trying to recreate the old relationship, their nervous system often interprets that as closeness arriving too quickly. Their instinctive response is to pull away once again. Around this same period, some avoidants appear to do something that feels completely contradictory. They may start seeing someone new, reconnect with a previous partner, or casually begin dating again. From your perspective, it can seem like undeniable proof that they never cared about you. But that's often an oversimplification. What they're frequently seeking isn't necessarily a replacement for you. They're trying to recreate connection in an environment that feels emotionally safer. A new relationship doesn't yet carry shared history, unresolved conflict, or expectations built over time. It feels lighter because there's no emotional weight attached to it. For a while, that distance can create the illusion that everything is different. Unfortunately, it rarely stays that way. As emotional closeness naturally develops, the same attachment patterns often return. The same protective walls rise. The same cycle begins repeating itself. This is one of the most important truths about avoidant attachment. The pattern isn't centered around you. It never truly was. You weren't too emotional. You weren't too needy. You weren't asking for something unreasonable. You were simply seeking the kind of emotional connection that most healthy relationships naturally require. The real struggle existed inside an attachment system that had learned to protect itself by creating distance, regardless of who was standing on the other side. Understanding that isn't about excusing harmful behavior. It's about understanding the pattern so you can stop blaming yourself for something you never created. And once you understand the map, you can finally decide whether it's leading you somewhere you actually want to go. As the third and fourth weeks of no contact arrive, another major shift often takes place. Your absence is no longer something new. It no longer feels like temporary freedom. It slowly becomes part of their emotional reality. What once felt like relief gradually transforms into a quiet sense of weight. For someone who has spent years coping by shutting down uncomfortable emotions, this becomes unfamiliar territory. They can distract themselves. They can bury themselves in work. They can spend time with friends or pursue new relationships. But beneath all of that activity, something still feels incomplete. This is one of the most private stages of the process. Many avoidants would never openly admit what they're experiencing. Some barely admit it to themselves. If you could hear their inner dialogue, it probably wouldn't begin with, "I miss them." Instead, it often starts much smaller. "I wonder what they're doing." Then it becomes, "Why haven't they reached out?" Eventually, another question quietly appears. What if they've actually moved on? That final thought is incredibly important because it touches the deepest fear beneath avoidant attachment. Many people assume avoidants fear intimacy more than anything else, but underneath that protective surface lies an even deeper fear: being abandoned, being left behind, believing they weren't enough for someone they cared about. That's one of the greatest ironies of avoidant attachment. The people they distance themselves from are often the very people whose permanent absence would affect them the most. Creating distance feels safer than risking being the one who gets left. Ending things first often feels less painful than waiting for someone else to walk away. So when you maintain genuine no contact without checking in, leaving subtle hints, or creating excuses to reconnect, you're not simply removing your attention. You're activating one of the deepest attachment wounds they carry. This usually doesn't happen during the first week. It often isn't fully present during the second either. But somewhere around weeks 3 and 4, when your absence has become impossible to ignore, those fears can begin surfacing. They start asking themselves questions they were avoiding before. What if this time they're really finished? Did I push them too far? What if they've found someone who makes them happier than I ever could? What if I actually lost something that mattered? For the first time, they're confronting feelings they can't easily explain away. Longing becomes much harder to suppress. Now, it's important to understand something. Feeling those emotions doesn't automatically mean they'll contact you. They're still battling the same internal programming. They're still convincing themselves they're okay. They're still trying to appear unaffected, even to themselves. But maintaining that emotional mask becomes increasingly difficult. Eventually, cracks begin to show. Some avoidants casually mention your name while talking with friends, pretending it means nothing. They might ask a mutual friend how you've been, acting completely indifferent while secretly hoping for information. Others unexpectedly find themselves driving past places the two of you used to visit. Maybe they tell themselves it was coincidence. Maybe they genuinely believe it. A song that reminds them of you suddenly catches their attention. They listen for a few moments before quickly skipping it because allowing themselves to fully feel those emotions is still uncomfortable. Some will type out a message to you several different times before deleting it every single time. Not because they have nothing to say, but because sending it would force them to face what those feelings truly mean. This is also the stage where many people who broke no contact later wish they had stayed patient just a little longer. Why? Because this is often when the avoidant is finally sitting with emotions they avoided throughout much of the relationship. Breaking the silence too early releases that emotional pressure. It gives them immediate relief before they've had enough time to truly process what they're feeling. But after understanding everything happening inside their world, we have to ask a far more important question. What's happening inside yours? Maybe you started no contact, hoping it would make them miss you. Maybe someone recommended it. Maybe you believed it was the only way to get their attention. But if you stay committed long enough, something unexpected usually begins happening. You start changing too. That's because real no contact isn't only about creating distance from another person. It's about reconnecting with yourself. When you're involved with an avoidant, your nervous system often stays on constant alert. You analyze every text. You search for hidden meanings behind delayed replies. You replay conversations in your mind, wondering what you did wrong whenever they become distant. You begin shrinking parts of yourself, hoping you'll feel easier for them to love. Over time, that becomes emotionally exhausting. Many people don't even recognize how drained they've become until everything finally goes quiet. Then something remarkable begins happening. Without the constant uncertainty, your nervous system gradually settles. You stop checking your phone every few minutes. You stop rehearsing the perfect message. You stop living in anticipation of their next response. As that emotional tension fades, your perspective becomes clearer. You begin remembering who you were before the relationship consumed so much of your emotional energy. You remember what it feels like to experience consistency, to feel chosen, To be with someone who doesn't make love feel like an endless puzzle you have to solve. And as your identity slowly returns, something truly transformative begins to unfold. As you continue healing, something quietly changes inside you. The avoidant no longer occupies the same amount of space in your thoughts. That doesn't mean they suddenly become unimportant or that you erase the good memories. It simply means they stop holding so much influence over your emotional world. They are no longer the center around which every feeling, hope, and fear revolves. Then another realization begins to emerge, and it's both freeing and deeply emotional. You recognize that you weren't only mourning the loss of that person. You were mourning the future you believed the two of you could build together. You were grieving the version of them you met at the beginning, the one who seemed open, affectionate, attentive, and emotionally available before their defenses gradually returned, before the distance grew, before every period of silence left you wondering what you had done wrong. The relationship you kept fighting for was often built around possibility rather than reality. And grieving unrealized potential is its own unique kind of loss. It's real, it's painful, and it deserves to be acknowledged for what it is. Now let's shift back to what's happening inside the avoidance mind. We've already explored what often unfolds during weeks 3 and 4. But what if you continue honoring no contact beyond that point? While every avoidant is different, certain patterns appear again and again. Some people are more self-aware than others. Some have stronger avoidant tendencies than others. There is no universal timeline. Still, after 5 or 6 weeks, or even longer, your absence has usually become woven into their everyday life. It no longer feels temporary. It has become part of their new reality. From here, the path often moves in one of two directions. The first is emotional shutdown. In this scenario, the avoidance protective system takes over completely. Instead of processing the relationship, they disconnect from the emotions attached to it. They bury the memories, avoid confronting the loss, and continue forward as though nothing significant happened. They never reach out. They never reopen the conversation. From the outside, it appears they've completely moved on. But appearances can be misleading. Their silence doesn't necessarily mean the relationship lacked meaning. It often means their coping mechanisms are so deeply ingrained that even meaningful heartbreak gets filtered through emotional numbness. Some avoidants carry unresolved feelings about important relationships for years, sometimes much longer, without ever fully examining what those relationships meant or why they ended. The second possibility is the one many people secretly hope for: a breakthrough. It doesn't happen as often, but it absolutely can. This outcome is more likely when the relationship carried genuine emotional depth, when the avoidant has developed some level of self-awareness, and when your absence forces them to confront patterns they've spent years avoiding. Eventually, they reach out. But it's essential to understand what that message actually represents. It isn't proof that everything has changed. It isn't evidence that they've suddenly become emotionally secure. It's simply the beginning of a conversation, one that could eventually lead toward healing, but only if they're genuinely willing to face themselves and do the difficult work required for lasting change. An avoidant contacting you after no contact doesn't automatically mean they've transformed. It often means that, for the moment, the pain of losing you has become stronger than the fear of moving closer. The challenge is that fear rarely disappears on its own. Once emotional closeness starts building again, those old protective instincts can quickly return if nothing underneath has actually changed. That's why, if an avoidant reaches back out, your response matters far more than many people realize. Don't rush to recreate the relationship exactly as it was. Don't immediately resume constant communication. And don't feel obligated to express overwhelming excitement simply because they came back. Those reactions are completely understandable, but they can unintentionally recreate the same emotional dynamic that existed before. When an avoidant suddenly feels intense closeness returning all at once, their nervous system may once again interpret it as emotional pressure. That's often when the familiar cycle begins repeating itself. A healthier approach is very different. Stay calm. Move slowly. Respond with kindness, but not urgency. Let your actions communicate that you've continued living your life, that you've found stability within yourself, and that your happiness no longer depends on whether they're present every day. Even if you genuinely miss them, allow your responses to come from confidence rather than emotional desperation. To an avoidant, someone who appears emotionally grounded and capable of standing on their own often feels far less overwhelming than someone whose emotional balance depends entirely on the relationship. Only when both people approach the connection from a place of emotional stability can something healthier begin taking shape. But here's the truth I hope you remember more than anything else. The real purpose of no contact isn't getting an avoidant back. At least, it shouldn't be. When no contact becomes a strategy to make someone return, you're placing your emotional well-being on an outcome you can't control. You're gambling with your own heart. And that's a game that rarely ends well. True no contact serves a very different purpose. It's an opportunity to create enough distance to finally see the relationship clearly. Not through the lens of hope, not through the memories of how wonderful things felt in the beginning, not through fantasies about who they might become someday, but through the reality of what the relationship consistently gave you. That clarity allows you to make decisions from a place of emotional balance instead of fear. Not because anxiety is pushing you, but because self-respect is guiding you. Make your choices from a place of self-respect, not from the fear of losing someone. Choose the relationship you truly deserve, not the one you're desperately trying to hold together. You deserve someone who chooses you willingly, without needing to be chased or convinced. You deserve a relationship where you don't have to hide parts of yourself just to keep the peace. And you deserve a partner who moves toward you when life feels difficult instead of pulling away. Healthy relationships aren't free from fear. The difference is that secure partners face those fears together instead of treating each other as the problem. It's also important to remember that avoidants aren't bad people. Many are deeply caring individuals who learned early in life that vulnerability wasn't safe. To protect themselves, they built emotional walls that once helped them survive. But those same defenses often prevent them from experiencing the deep connection they truly want. That's why stepping back and allowing silence isn't abandoning them. It's accepting a difficult truth. You cannot love someone into healing. They have to choose that path themselves. Some avoidants may never make that choice. Others might, but only after significant self-reflection, therapy, or life experiences force them to confront their patterns. A few will genuinely change over time and return with greater honesty and consistency. But none of that is yours to control. The sooner you accept that, not just in your mind, but in your heart, the sooner you'll stop putting your life on hold while waiting for someone else's healing. Your responsibility isn't to wait. It's to become clear about who you are, what you need, and the kind of relationship that allows you to feel emotionally safe, respected, and valued. If you're in no contact with an avoidant, remember this. The silence you're experiencing isn't empty. It's creating room for you to reconnect with yourself. It's where you stop carrying someone else's emotional burden and begin listening to your own needs. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What kind of love do I truly want?" Your needs aren't too much. Wanting consistency, emotional availability, honesty, and genuine commitment isn't needy or unreasonable. It's healthy. So keep your silence, not to make them chase you, but to give yourself the space to heal. Because the greatest transformation that comes from no contact isn't always the one happening inside the avoidant. It's the one happening inside you.